Hello everyone, welcome to Writing Analysis. This episode I'm going to be talking about Game of Thrones and why I don't feel it's masterful or genius or any other variation of those words. Now, I know anytime there's ever like a really popular story that's being called masterful or genius or just really popular in general, there's always got to be those a-holes who jump online and say, well, you know what? You're stupid for liking this show, and I'm going to explain why. And then they go into all these details about these little plot holes or little mistakes that the story makes. And then they say, see, look, it's not masterful, it has flaws. Well, that's not what this is, because first of all, I don't think anyone's stupid for liking Game of Thrones. Even though I personally don't, I understand why other people do. Secondly, and more importantly, is I realize that every story in the world has, flaws or plot holes, even my personal favorites. There's no such thing as a perfect story. And, just because a story isn't perfect, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not masterful or genius. Because again, every story is flawed, but I do feel there are stories that are masterful and or genius. So that's not what this is. Now, another thing I would like to explain really quickly is any writer that I'm aware of, and this includes myself, will tell you that we look at stories in two different ways. We look at stories as fans and we look at stories as writers. Now, as fans, we don't really think about like structure or logic or plot holes or anything like that. We just think about, does this story entertain me? And whether it's entertaining because it's funny or because it's really good, or even if it's so bad that we enjoy how bad it is, just for whatever reason, just do we enjoy this story? Does this story satisfy our personal entertainment? And then we look at stories as writers, where we do think about structure and, plot holes and other things like that, and just how big those plot holes are, how much those plot holes bother us, and all that other good stuff. Now, as a fan, I actually did like Game of Thrones for probably about the first 3, maybe even 4 seasons. I don't remember exactly where the cutoff point was. But I do remember why I stopped liking it, is because, in my opinion, they pushed the button too many times. And what I mean by that is, like, a lot of times in a story, if there's going to be some like major character death or like some big plot twist or reveal, they usually kind of pick and choose those moments. Whereas Game of Thrones, it's just happening all the time. And I understand why people like that. But for me personally, I became desensitized to it. I just saw it so much that it just no longer shocks me. So, like, if a major character dies, even if I didn't suspect that that specific character was going to die, if someone were to ask me like, oh my gosh, can you believe they killed this character? My response would simply be, yeah, because they kill major characters all the time. I now expect major characters to die. And same thing like when characters betray one another. If someone were to ask me, oh my gosh, could you believe this character betrayed this character? I would say yes, because characters betray each other practically every episode. It happens all the time. So again, even if I didn't expect it specifically, the fact that it happened is no longer surprising to me. There's no shock value anymore. And I think most people would agree that once the shock value is gone, there's not really a whole lot left. Now, as a writer, I dislike it, but for a completely different reason. Now, I'm not saying it's horribly written, because it's not. I just don't feel it's masterful or genius. And I know a lot of people say, well, that's just your opinion, and movies and shows are, completely subjective. And I slightly disagree with that. I do feel personal taste is completely subjective, but I do feel there are other things that can be measured. For instance, if you have someone who's cooked like a really fancy bread-crusted Brazino, which from what I understand is like a harder thing to make, and then you have another person who's made a Big Mac. Now, which one tastes better is completely subjective. There's going to be lots of people who prefer the Big Mac. I would probably prefer the Big Mac. I love Big Macs. But there is no question that it takes more talent and skill to cook the bread-crusted Brazino than it does to simply flip the burger at McDonald's. That there is no question. Which is why even if you love Big Macs, even if Big Macs are your all-time favorite food, you're probably not going to go tell your friends that the people who work at McDonald's are masterful chefs. Because not only are you going to get a lot of really weird looks, but it's also pretty insulting to people who actually are chefs, like the people who can cook those more difficult things. Now, I'm not saying that everything in life needs to be difficult in order to be enjoyed. There's absolutely nothing wrong with enjoying something simple. Again, I'm just saying something like masterful or genius, those words are typically reserved for the things that are more difficult to accomplish. And no matter how good you think a Big Mac tastes, we all know it's not very difficult to do. And sadly, writing a show like Game of Thrones is not difficult to do, and I'm going to logically explain why. Because the difficult part of writing is not coming up with ideas. That's the easiest part of writing. The difficult part of writing is solving the paradox. Because as you're writing a story, as you're developing things, whether you realize it or not, you're actually doing two things. Because as you establish who the characters are, you are also establishing who the characters are not. As you're establishing what the story is, you are also establishing what the story is not. So then you are presented with a unique challenge of how do I expand these characters, how do I expand this story in new and preferably surprising ways while still remaining loyal to what I have already established. Now I'm going to go ahead and give you some specific examples. So hopefully everyone who's watching this has seen the show House. If you haven't, there's going to be spoilers and you should probably check it out. It's actually a really good show. It's one of my favorite shows of all time, and House is actually one of my favorite characters of all time because he is a very difficult character to pull off. He's a character who has very strong personality traits. For instance, he's a doctor, and that's not just his profession. That's who he is. That's who he is at his absolute core. He is a doctor. So no matter what happens throughout the show, he always has to be a doctor. Now, sure, you could do a couple episodes here and there where he's not a doctor, but as far as long-term direction, you can't be like, oh, well, he was a doctor for the first 3 seasons, but now in season 4, he's going to be an electrician or a real estate agent, because then the show just doesn't make sense anymore. Also, he's an asshole, and he has to be an asshole. Again, you could do a couple episodes here and there where like maybe he's like got a bet with Wilson or something like that, but as far as long-term direction, you can't be like, oh, well, he was an asshole, but now he's a kind, compassionate doctor. Because not only does it just not really make sense for a character with such a strong personality to undergo such a dramatic change, but it's also one of the things people love about the show. We love hearing him say these wild and most of the time very inappropriate things. Also, he's an addict. And the thing about addicts is that they're always an addict. Sometimes they can replace an unhealthy addiction with a more healthy addiction, but they're always an addict. But even though we know these things, there is always something new. We know he's going to be a doctor, but every episode it was a new case. He never cures the same disease more than once. It was always a different case, a different set of symptoms, a different set of circumstances, a different puzzle, as they often refer to it as. And the puzzles themselves were kind of a paradox because they have to be complex enough that one of the smartest doctors in the world, it takes him the whole episode to figure it out, but it can't be so complex that the audience can't get it once you explain it. So that's kind of a paradox in itself. But anyways, like I said, it's always a new case. And then also we know he's going to be an asshole, but there's all of these different levels. Like sometimes he'll say something that's offensive. Sometimes he says something that's only mildly offensive. Sometimes he says something that's offensive, but he does it to make a good point. Sometimes he's just being an asshole. Sometimes he takes it really, really far. And every once in a while, he's sort of being an asshole, but he's actually trying to be nice. Like in his own weird, twisted way, he's actually trying to be nice or to do what he feels is right. Also, like I said, with him being an addict, he's always an addict all throughout the show. It's not always Vicodin, but he's always an addict. So they have all of these consistencies, but again, it's always new experiences. So throughout the 8 seasons, the character grows, he evolves, he changes, but they always remain loyal to who he is as a character. He's always a doctor, he's always an asshole, he's always an addict. The character he is in the very first episode and the character he is at the end of the season, or the end of the series, it's the same guy. He's gone through stuff, he's gone through new experiences, new circumstances, all of these new things, but they always remain loyal to who he is as a character. Now, I'm not saying every character needs to be this way. In fact, I really don't think you could have every character be this way. Because a lot of stories are about characters changing. Either a character is growing up, or they're trying to figure out who they are, or maybe they're one way, but they want to change and they want to be better, or, whatever. And all of that's fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with any of that. I'm just saying this is an example of a character who is very difficult to pull off because fans have very specific expectations of who and what he is supposed to be, but they still want to be surprised. And that is a very difficult combination to pull off, especially to pull off for 8 seasons. And then when it comes to story, let's look at the first season of Daredevil on Netflix. Now, we know that Kingpin is going to do bad things, and we know that Daredevil is going to try to stop him. Again, there's going to be spoilers if you haven't seen it. But the actual specifics of which are unknown to us. But more importantly, is every actual storyline throughout the show directly ties into that idea of Daredevil versus the Kingpin. Like with Karen. First of all, she's involved in that because she uncovers some information about Kingpin's deal, and then she's in danger and all of that stuff. So she ties into the idea that way. Plus her relationship with Matt and the fact that he has to lie to her, so he's having trouble balancing his personal life with his war on crime, which directly relates to that idea. All of the stuff with the black reporter guy. I don't remember his name at the moment. I'm terrible with names. But he's trying to get information on the Kingpin and all that stuff and try to find out who the Kingpin is. So his storyline directly ties into that idea. Every actual storyline directly ties into that idea. Now, you could do individual scenes that don't have anything to do with that. Like they do scenes where they set things up for the next season. Or they do scenes of character development, where Matt and Foggy are in the bar just kind of hanging out. But again, any actual storyline needs to tie into that idea, because if it doesn't, it's going to feel out of place. If you did a storyline where Daredevil was ice skating, it would have to somehow relate to that idea. So maybe the place he's doing the ice skating at is a front company for the Kingpin, and he's kind of doing some undercover work. That would make sense. But if you just randomly have a storyline where Daredevil is ice skating, people are going to be like, why am I watching Daredevil ice skate? What is going on here? So again, it's somewhat of a paradox. How could I expand the story while remaining loyal to the main theme or idea of what this story is about? And lastly, we have the twist. Now, most people think of a twist as being completely unrelated, because a lot of times, the story looks like it's going to go this way, but then suddenly it takes a turn that way, or vice versa, or whatever. However, a twist can still remain loyal. For instance, if you've ever seen The Usual Suspects, again, this is going to be spoilers if you haven't, you don't think Kevin Spacey's the bad guy. But once you find out that he is the bad guy, all of these things kind of start clicking in your head. You're like, oh, that's why he said this, and that's why he did this, and that's why this happened. And you realize they were giving you clues all along, you just didn't see it. Again, it's a paradox. How could I show the audience that he's the bad guy without them realizing that he's the bad guy? So these are the things that make writing difficult, is solving these paradoxes. However, with a story like Game of Thrones, none of these paradoxes exist, because for the most part, every character wants power, and everyone understands that power, or even the pursuit of power, corrupts people. It changes people. So then it becomes very easy to change the character parameters. You can be like, oh, well, this character was a good guy for the first couple seasons, but now they're going to be a bad guy. Or this character was this, but now they're this. And it's one thing if you have a few characters like that. A lot of stories do. They'll have a wild card character. And again, that's fine. But pretty much every character in Game of Thrones is like this. Every character just kind of flip-flops in whatever direction is most convenient for them at that time, or whatever direction they believe is going to get them power. So you never have to ask yourself, how can I expand this character's story while remaining loyal to who they are? Because who they are is flip-floppers. Pretty much every single one of them. And then you think about story. There is no main character, and there is no main theme or idea. Some people argue that the main theme or idea is that all these people want the Iron Throne, but there has been plenty of storylines throughout the show that have absolutely nothing to do with that. One example would be when Arya is with the Hound, and he's trying to take her to her aunt because he wants reward money. That was a whole storyline. That wasn't just a scene. That was a whole storyline for, I believe, an entire season. It was kind of running through. And that has absolutely nothing to do with the Iron Throne. He doesn't want the Iron Throne. She doesn't want the Iron Throne. Their journey was in no way leading them towards the Iron Throne, and there's plenty of other storylines throughout the show that have absolutely nothing to do with that. So again, you never have to ask yourself, how can I expand this story while remaining loyal to the main theme or idea? There really is no main theme or idea. You could basically just do whatever you want. I mean, outside of completely ridiculous ideas. I mean, if you said, hey, let's have an alien show up riding unicorns with shark lasers, like, okay, that's not going to work. But aside from just completely ridiculous ideas, you could basically just do whatever you want. And then you have the twist. Now, all of these twists and character deaths really just come out of nowhere. And I don't mean to say they happen for no reason, because there is a reason. There's always a reason why these characters are killing each other, why they're betraying each other, and everything like that. So that's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is they're not like set up, they're not foreshadowed or anything like that. And again, a lot of people like this idea, and I understand why they like this idea that you're just completely blindsided. But it's not difficult to come up with a twist that just comes out of nowhere. I could sit here and say, hey, what if that chick in red, I can never pronounce her name, she's kind of like a witch and whatever, she always wears red, she has the red hair, I'm sure you know who I'm talking about. Like, what if she can control people who she brings back to life? And that's why she brought Jon Snow back to life. And as soon as he sits on the Iron Throne at the end, if that's what happens, she'll kind of come in, be able to control him, and then basically she'll rule everything. Boom, twist out of nowhere. Or what if Jaime kills Cersei's after she has their child? I mean, we all know he basically blames her for their other children dying. I mean, he could be like, you killed our other children. I'm not going to let you kill this one. And I actually think that's going to happen, by the way. But again, boom, twist out of nowhere. I could literally just sit here for days and think of twists that could come out of nowhere. It is not difficult to do at all. But you set up a twist, that is a lot more difficult because first of all, you have to have forethought, because if you want the twist to happen here, you have to start thinking about it way back here. And then you have to think of subtle ways to leave these clues without the audience picking up on it. So it does take a lot more effort. And not only is it just more difficult, but I also think that it's ultimately more rewarding, because if you set up a twist, then it makes the second viewing a different experience. Because if the audience decides to go back and watch it or read it a second time, then they can start picking up on all the subtle clues, like, oh, I get what you mean by you saying that, and oh, that's why he wasn't in the room, and etc., etc. And it becomes a whole new experience. Whereas if the twist just comes out of nowhere, that's only good once. So not only is it more difficult, but also I think it's more rewarding to the audience to set up the twist. The main point I'm getting at is it's not difficult to make your characters interesting if there's no like parameters you have to follow, and you can pretty much just have your characters flip-flop in whatever direction you want. It is not difficult to expand your story and have your story go in new directions if there's no main theme or idea or character that everything needs to connect to. And it is not difficult to come up with a twist that just comes out of nowhere. There is no aspect of Game of Thrones that is actually difficult to do. So again, if you like it, that's totally fine. That is 100% subjective, and I have no problems with it. But to say it's masterful or genius is not only, in my opinion, incorrect, but it's also very insulting to other writers that are actually good. And there you have it. That's my opinion of Game of Thrones and why it isn't masterful. Hopefully you enjoyed it, although I'm sure most of you probably didn't, because I know it's a very popular show. Just don't kill me, okay?